What's up, everyone? Welcome back for another installment of this Learn TV series. My name is Christos Matskas. I'm a senior program manager for Identity, and today we're going to be looking at permissions and consent framework. If you want to follow along, make sure to use the URL that you see on your screen, ak.ms learn-identity-permissions-consent. That's a mouthful, I know. And with me today, I have JP from the middle of nowhere in Michigan, trying to send all his pixels to us. How are you, JP?
Oh, not too bad. Just a little, it's like a throwback to like YouTube in the late '90s or early 2000s. Everything was like 320 by 160, and that's what I get today. So it's all good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really happy to have you back. It's been an adventurous kind of a week. So tell us what we're going to be doing today.
So this is part 3 of a 5-part series on implementing Microsoft Identity. Today we're going to talk about permissions and consent, which is everything having to do with admin consent, if you're familiar with that, or if you've seen that or been blocked by that when you're working with Azure AD. All sorts of things around what kind of permissions we've got and how they work with different types of applications. So I think it'll be a really interesting one. This is the third part of a 5-part series, which is the learning path. So we're going to work on this module today, but this is part of a broader 5-part series, which you can go and complete at your leisure on your own time, and come back and watch these videos if you get stuck or if you've got any questions or anything like that. And of course, we are live, so feel free to ask questions. Tell us where you're from. I'm in, like Christos said, I'm in the middle of nowhere in Michigan this week on vacation with my family, with my in-laws, where the where the internet is not super fantastic, but we'll make do. We'll work with what we got.
Yes, absolutely. And before we go, just to recap what the learning objective will be for this module, we're going to be comparing and contrasting permission types that are supported by the Microsoft Identity Platform. We're going to also be looking at static and dynamic consent, which is very important, especially if you're using the V2 latest stuff that we introduced in the last few years. And then we're going to show you how to create applications that implement dynamic consent and incrementally updating permissions. So there will be some demos, there will be some slides, and there will be some questions happening throughout the module. So make sure to pay attention because we will be taking a quiz throughout this module. So JP is going to kick it off with the introduction and talking about the Microsoft Identity Platform and OAuth 2.
Cool. So OAuth 2, if you've been with us for the past few weeks, we talked a lot about OAuth 2 and what it is and how it works. But just as our quick little refresh, it's a fast way or an easy way for developers to access other people's stuff in other systems, but without giving them carte blanche access. So one of the things we talked about was, say, my Microsoft account, not like a work account, but like my consumer account where my like Outlook.com or Hotmail address is, and Xbox and all that sort of stuff. I may want to redeem a code or something to connect my Xbox account to something, or maybe I want to like get my Call of Duty stats or something in some other kind of a tool. But do I really want the Call of Duty people being able to read my email and see my calendar and do all that? Probably not. Payment methods, all that. And so OAuth has this whole concept of selectively allowing me as a user to choose what I want to give access to for a specific application. And so for that to work, we have to have this concept of sort of permissions of like, okay, well, what are you, the user, allowed to do? And what is the application that you're using allowed to do as well? And so that's really what we're gonna dig into a lot today, is what are these two different types of permissions that we have, and how you can start to implement them in your own application. So the first big thing we're going to look at is, say we've got an app, and the application is going to be able to say, I've got certain things or certain pieces of data, and they're grouped logically. So this is up to the developer. This is up to you. Your application may be something like an expenses app, and your expenses app may have approvals, or it may have certain expenses that you're allowed to see, but maybe other kinds of expenses you aren't allowed to see. You may be able to approve certain expenses from, say, a mobile app, but maybe the biggest expenses, like Christos's expenses, you have to do them from a web app, right? And so we have to, as the developers, we have to logically define what these groups of permissions are, and not only what those permissions are, but then what kinds of resources are they allowed to touch, and what can they do to those resources. So that could be things like, I want this app to be able to approve expenses, but I may want this other app to only be able to read expenses. So maybe I can see the expenses that have been submitted, but I can't take any action on them until I'm back in front of, say, a web app that's more feature rich or whatever. So let's deconstruct how our permissions are and kind of get over some of the vocabulary that we're going to be dealing with today. So you may have heard of the term scope. Scope is sort of the name of like a fully qualified permission. So me saying I have the https graph.microsoft.com/mail.read scope means that I can read somebody's mail. So if I've been granted that permission or granted that scope, I can go read somebody's mail. But there are two main components here. We've got the resource itself, and resource is one of the things you'll hear thrown around a whole lot, and we've already used it a bunch up to this point, and we're going to continue using it a lot. Resource is the main sort of API. So this is the thing that you're going to call. Within that resource are multiple permissions. In this case, the permission is something like mail.read. Now this is for Microsoft Graph, which is our big entry point for all Microsoft APIs relating to things like Office and Teams and all that sort of stuff. But this could be your app too. This could be apps.contoso.com/expenses.read, right? So you can define these as a developer, the things that make sense for your app. And there are lots and lots of them for you to choose from for building apps that are relying on Microsoft platforms to access other data. When you're actually in the portal, you're going to see these called app IDs, the app ID URI, and that's going to be your resource. So that's in your manifest file. You'll also see that when you're defining these scopes, like in the expose an API window. And that's sort of like your namespace, for lack of a better term. It doesn't have to be the URL that the user is going to use. It could be completely arbitrary. But it does need to be globally unique, because that's going to be the unique identifier, the unique namespace for all the permissions we're going to expose inside of that. Then we have our actual permission, which in this case is mail.read. And so our fully qualified scope is what gives us this full graph.microsoft.com thing. So let's look at our two permission types. So we've got two main ones that we look at and that Azure AD supports. And this is what you'll see primarily using any sort of OAuth 2 provider. So we got this thing called delegated permissions, and we have things called app permissions. Delegated permissions are, delegation at this point is kind of a fancy word for on behalf of the user, right? But on behalf of is already used in another OAuth 2 concept. And so I guess they were like, well, we can't use that term, so let's use delegated instead. But it gives us a way to ask a user, as the developer, we say, hey, user, can I read your calendar? Right? So we've got these marked out here, like read the user's calendar and shared calendars, and then things like read write, be able to read and write the user's calendar, but it's all scoped to just that one user. So if Christos came to my app, he could say, yeah, I'm going to let this app read my calendar, and that app can now read his calendar, but it can't read my calendar or anybody else's calendar until those users have said that's okay. And the that's okay part of that is consent, and that's what we're gonna jump into here shortly. The other side of these are application permissions. If you're familiar with like old school service accounts, like in Windows on-prem, for example, or not just Windows, but you may have a service account, and that service account accesses something, but there's no user sitting there, and that's the key. These things have access to do, for example, read everybody's calendar, read and write everybody's calendar in all mailboxes. So app permissions are useful in the sense that they're really good for things like integration. So if you need to do big exports or big imports, or you want to schedule task or a service, something like that, but not really good in terms of trying to access an individual user's calendar.
Right. I have a question.
Okay.
So would you say that delegated permissions are usually when we have user interaction, whereas app permissions is usually when there's no user
Yep,
in place to consent and stuff? Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, because an application permission is going to be something where there really is no user present.
Mm.
So app permissions you see being used a lot more in things like integration, enterprise app type scenarios. Like if you need to export a bunch of data, import a bunch of data, run maintenance tasks, that sort of thing. That's where we see app permissions used more so than delegated.
Mhm.
If you're building an app where you want to operate on a user's data, and if that user's sitting in front of the app, that's when delegated permissions are the better way to go.
Nice. Thank you.
So those two things in mind, that doesn't obviate any permissions you might have within that system too, right? So when we think about delegated permissions, let's say Azure, right? So I may give a service principal access to my Azure subscription, right? But it's going to get, not only is it going to be only what the app is allowed to do per the scopes that are granted, but it's also going to be what I'm allowed to do because it is acting as me, right? Or it's acting on my behalf. And so the ability of the effective permission, the actual permissions that are granted to an app can't be beyond what the user is allowed to do in most cases when you're talking about delegated permissions. Because if you don't have access to my Azure subscription, for example, Christos, when you sign into this app, you'll see your Azure subscriptions and any of mine that you may have access to, but you're not going to be conferred additional access just because you allow this thing to happen. So this middle ground, this overlap, that's what the effective permissions are. And it really comes down to what the app is allowed to do combined with what the user is allowed to do. But what the user is allowed to do is typically driven by like an RBAC system within it, like the Azure role-based access control of I'm going to make Christos a contributor on my resource group. He'd still be limited by that, the fact that he's only a contributor, in addition to any scopes that we may have granted the app to go and do stuff. Yeah.
And can the app provide you with more permissions that you have as part of the org RBAC? Like if the app, no. So I can't be elevated to an admin through the app. It will always be a combination, the lowest common denominator between the RBAC permissions in the org, I guess, and the app permissions in the app, right?
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little dangerous with stuff like application permissions, because if an app has app permissions, which are, read everybody's mailbox, then now that application needs to be really sure that it's only showing mailboxes to the users who should see them, because at that point, the app has access to see everything and the user's permissions don't matter to Azure AD at that point.
Which is a perfect segue for this consent framework, right?
Yeah, so the thing is, we talk about these permissions and we talk about granting the permissions, but how do we do that, right? And that whole experience is called consent. And if you've ever used Azure AD for literally anything, then you will have most likely you will have gone through our consent process. Unless you have administrators who are really on top of things and they consent everything and don't allow you to consent. But in most cases, everyone will have seen this consent dialogue at some point. And this is what it looks like. So it pretty much is pretty straightforward. It's kind of what you would see with any OAuth provider, with a Facebook, a Google, Twitter, or anybody. I want this app to post tweets on my behalf, or I want this app to be able to read my Facebook friends, or whatever. The things that are in here are driven by what the developer has either configured or requested. And Christos is going to talk a lot about configuration versus requests here in a couple of minutes. But when the user signs in, they're going to be asked to consent. So in this case, they're asking to sign in and read your profile. It's asking to read your mail, and it's asking to maintain access to data. And what the cryptic maintain access to data really means is we're going to grant a refresh token. And if you remember from a couple episodes ago, those refresh tokens let these apps continually get access tokens without asking the user first. which is if you don't want to have to, if you saw this window every hour on your mobile phone when you went to check your email, most people would not
away.
like that.
Yeah, throw the phone away or uninstall the app. Phone. It's about managing security plus user experience. You want to have the right balance there. You don't want untethered access all the time, but you also don't want to prompt the user every 30 seconds for, are you sure you want to sign in here? Right? There's this other thing that you're going to talk about, which is, I think next is admin consent, which we've suffered quite a bit as we try to do stuff with our tenant, and there's a workaround, but please explain.
So admin consent is it's an important part. Now, admin consent isn't a part of a spec. It is part of how Azure AD itself works, right? All the spec is really interested in terms of OAuth 2 is a user is allowed to grant consent, but how the user goes about doing that is kind of left up for interpretation by the provider. And in our case, we've got two levels or two types of consent. We've got regular user consent, where any normal user can say, yeah, I want to allow this app to read my calendar, for example. Certain permissions may be too broad. They may have impact beyond just the user. Things like, let me read all the user's contacts, which would include the GAL or the global address list in Exchange, right? In fact, we've kind of seen that as being a little bit of a problem, where people get an account in some kind of a directory somewhere, and then a malicious app tries to read all their calendars and then exfiltrate the GAL, right? In fact, and I hate to say this, years ago I worked at a place and I was doing consulting, and one of the salespeople at our place called me and said, hey, could you download a copy of the GAL and send it to me? And I was like, what? I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. But, you think a company like a Microsoft or even a 25-person company that is, like a small business somewhere, those people in your directory and those people in your address list, you, Christos, probably shouldn't have the ability to let another app read the whole GAL, nor should I or anybody. Mm-hmm. Right? That's not really a thing that I should be allowed to provide, because it's one thing to let an app read my calendar. It's another thing to let an app read the entire global address list. So we have this concept of admin consent. And with admin consent, it's all about, we have permissions that are marked that say only an administrator can consent to this. That's the key. If you're an administrator, this checkbox will show up at the bottom. And it says consent on behalf of your organization. So if you're an administrator, you're going to see that. And that gives you the ability to say, yeah, I want to allow this because this is a privileged thing and we've done our due diligence, or we've reviewed this or reviewed that, and we feel safe letting this app do this. But only administrators are going to see that checkbox. And by checking that box and clicking accept, they're going to consent to that for the whole organization, which means subsequent users aren't going to see this prompt. If an administrator doesn't check the box but still clicks accept, it's just the same as a regular user doing it, right? Which is fine for user allowed or user consentable permissions, but for permissions that are only admin consent, it just won't be allowed. You'll get a window that says, "Oh, sorry, not today, pal." In our case at Microsoft, and in your case, especially with some of the bigger enterprises that we work with, they may have consent blocked for everything. So even if the portal says that you can consent to this as a user, you may try and find that your administrators have overridden that and said, no, this is not a consentable permission by a user.
Yeah, which different company will have different processes for escalating and requesting permissions. Here at Microsoft, we do have a whole process to request that. If you want to get unblocked and you want to develop to just move your app forward until you get approval, there's the Microsoft 365 developer program. They can sign up, and for free, you get a full Azure AD tenant with test data, and that actually gives you a P2 Azure AD, and you act as an admin. So there you can consent to your HUD's content and unblock you from the process of developing your app until such time that you're ready to go back to your IT admins and say, look, we have the application working. These are the permissions we need for these reasons. And you go through whatever process your company has. By the way, we have a question from our audience, and thanks for everyone for joining. We have people from Toronto, north of the UK. I don't know why it's specifically north of the UK, but I suspect everyone from the UK is welcome. Kansas and Greece. Thanks for joining us today. And Cuba, we got people from Cuba. Nice. And Andrew is asking, he's an IT pro, and he's asking, how should we protecting this? I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's the app registration or consent from a tenant level security. So we protect, yet manage and have oversight of what's happening in Azure AD. Which I think Azure AD comes with a lot of logging and a lot of functionality to allow IT pros to have an oversight of what's happening. And usually they're the ones that have to consent to things, as we just said. So I think they do a better job to cater to IT pros than they do a job to cater to dev people. In some cases, developers won't even have access to edit app registrations or create app registrations. So they have to go through a process. It all comes down to how locked down your Azure AD is and how locked down you want it to be. JP, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see customers, so our default out of the box experience is there's a set of permissions that users can consent to that are generally low privilege and not super risky. So a lot of the read-only ones that are reading a user's data, for example, like those are pretty
low risk.
At least low risk. The blast radius is lower in terms of the amount of damage that a malicious app could do. Administrators, of course, can override that. There's also a new feature, which I think is in preview, called admin consent workflow. So if you've turned this off, instead of your users hitting a stone wall of, oh, you need admin consent, sorry, good luck. Instead, you can request an administrator, say, hey, admin, I need blah, 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 blah. I need this permission for this business justification. Can you please go in and unblock it? And then the administrators will be able to go in and review those requests and either approve or deny them and send you back a message of what they did. So that's still preview right now, I'm pretty sure. But that's a big part of it is making the end user experience a little bit better. And then, like you said too, tons of auditing and logging around which permissions have been consented by which applications. And we've got some other features around things like publisher verification. Makes it easier to know that the app that you're consenting to has been vetted by, at least has been vetted as a real business by Microsoft, and that they're a Microsoft partner and that sort of thing. So there are various protections in place. Of course, it's always good to stay vigilant and watch what's happening, but you can also go and revoke these at any time. So any kind of consents that have been granted, they can always be revoked at any time, and that's a big advantage. So yeah, hope that helps.
Cool, thank you, sir.
Best
practices.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Best practices. Never got. I think we're going to go jump into a demo, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So the two biggest things about this, if you're a developer, is don't ask for more than you need. That's the biggest one. Don't ask for, don't go in and check every permission box, which that would be a lot of permissions, especially in Graph. Only request the permissions you need. Now, the permissions that you need for Microsoft services are fairly well documented in the docs. So depending on which API you're using, be it Graph or an Azure API or something like that, you should be able to go to the docs and determine, okay, I want to read somebody's calendar or I want to make this API call. Cool. These are the permissions that I need. Graph Explorer, aka.ms/GE. Really great thing to use with your developer tenant that Christos mentioned. And each one of the API calls that you make with Graph, it will tell you which permissions that you need, and you can even grant consent right there. But at the end of the day, only ask for what you need.
Mm-hmm.
Big thing. And if you don't need to write files, then just ask for read. If you only need to, read a calendar, just ask to read a calendar. The other thing that's really cool in V2, and the thing that I think is probably one of the best developer ease of use or developer, what's the word I'm thinking of? Things that make your life easier as a developer. That's a mouthful. There's a better way to say it, but I don't know what it is. You can ask now for permission when you need it, right? Which is a big difference from historically, where you had to ask for all the permissions that your app was ever going to need up front. now we can ask for permissions as we need them, which is really, really useful if, say, you have optional integrations with Teams or OneDrive or something different. And maybe you have a part of your app that's only accessible to a small percentage of users. Like maybe I should be able to write a calendar, but only for managers or something. I mean, I don't know, right? Whatever your app's gonna decide. But if you're in that case where you want to say add additional functionality, if you ask somebody for that up front before you even know if they're ever going to use that kind of functionality, they're going to say, "Wait a minute, this wants to write to my calendar. Why does it want to do that?" And we don't want to be in that world. So ask for the least things that you need, bare minimum that you need up front. Ask for things as you need them for other scenarios. And of course, the user may also say no.
Mm-hmm.
And if the user denies or can't consent, which is the case in a lot of big enterprises, if they can't consent or just decide to decline, your app needs to handle that. So you need to say, okay, well, maybe your core functionality is broken and you're just like, sorry, I can't use this till an admin does it. Or maybe your app's okay, you just lose some extra features, some extra end user features until it happens. But you'll have to deal with that scenario. You'll have to deal with that scenario on your own.
So while you're prepping for your awesome demo, which will describe, there's a question here from Sadie TV. I like that name. If I were trying to develop a system that allows users to create app registrations with specific claims to be used for authentication against some APIs, are there any recommendations how to do this? I suspect that you're trying to automate the process of creating app registrations. You can do that through MS Graph. You can use either tools like Azure CLI or PowerShell that wrap around MS Graph, or you can write your own code in .NET or Python or any of the supported libraries for MS Graph, as long as the user that is trying to execute that script or that code has the right permissions, then they can go ahead and automate that. In fact, if you were to do that as part of your CI/CD, then I would recommend using a service principal account that has just been granted that specific permission, and it's statically granted and admin consented. So therefore, it can just go and create app registrations inside your Azure AD tenant if you need to automate that. If you want to have user interaction, you can also do that as well. I think it's a privileged permission, so you need somebody with admin consent to be able to do that, if I remember correctly, or is it not?
For which one?
The creating applications in the tenant.
By default, you can create applications. It is changeable by your admin. So your admin could say you are not allowed to register apps, although that only seems to be the most oppressive of IT regimes that does that. I don't think we don't see that one nearly as frequently as, say, blocking certain types of consent. In most cases, you'll be able to register your own apps. And if you can register an app, then you can register an app through Graph, is really the net of that.
True. But if you create a service principal, you might have to, make sure that it has the right permissions there.
That's true.
Zahir is asking a question, but I'm not going to give it away because we're going to cover that next. So JB is going to take it with his demo.
Okay, so if you've been watching us for a while, look, the Teams little bar thing at the top that remembers your stickiness, which is nice.
Yes, it does. I was impressed.
So I'm here in the Azure AD Admin Center. This is ad.portal.azure.com. It would also be the same as going to portal.azure.com and just clicking Azure AD or Azure Active Directory. So we've got our app, and this is the same app that we've used in previous episodes here.
Yep.
And so let's get this up. It's called Learn Live Spa. And here's our Learn Live Spa. So our application has certain permissions, and that's what we use with this API permissions button here. And what we're doing is configuring which permissions we want this application to be allowed to ask for upfront. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to ask for. If we don't ask for anything else, the app is going to ask for user.read, which just allows you to sign in the user and read their user profile, which is pretty basic. You pretty much have to have this if you want a user to sign in. So let's go over to our code. We got our code up here. And our code has really, this is all just JavaScript. So it's all just running in the browser. We have this msal config object, and the msal config object is the main thing that we need to change in the code. This is the same code that you'll get if you run through the learn module yourself. And in the code, we need to make really 3 big changes. So in the msal config, we have our authentication, we have client ID. And so the client ID is the same as the application ID. In fact, I'm going to pull this up over to the side, although I don't know with this limited screen real estate if that will make this even remotely usable, but we'll try. So here's our application ID. It's this, I'll make it a little bit bigger. E160B, blah, 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 E160B, and we've got that here. Next, we need our authority, and the authority is really just a way to say which Azure AD should deal with this application. And so in most cases, you're going to be login.microsoftonline.com unless you're coming from a national cloud like Azure China, Azure Germany, or Azure Government. In most cases, you'll be login.microsoftonline.com. Now, because I only want people to sign in from my specific directory, I've also added my directory here at the end of that. So this is just the one that I'm using for today, which is jpda.onmicrosoft.com. The last thing we need, of course, is our redirect URI, which is where our application is hosted and where our users are going to go to use the apps. This is localhost 3007. So it's already up and running. It should be over here on localhost 3007. So let's open a new tab and let's go to localhost 3007. See what we get. Okay, so here's our app. It's just a browser app. It's just using what our library called msal.js, which is just our sort of base authentication library. So go ahead and hit sign in. And now you're seeing it's asking me, hey, I want to do things. I want to sign you in. Cool. I want to read your mail. I want to read your calendars, and I want to maintain access to data that you've given it access to. What's interesting here is sign you in and read your profile. That's one that we had in our list of permissions in the app registration in Azure AD. But reading my mail, reading my calendars, and maintaining access, these are not ones that we had provisioned up front. These aren't ones that we configured up front to say this app needs to read mail or read calendars. Now, because I'm an administrator, I have the option to consent on behalf of my whole org, which I could do, or I can just accept it, in which case I've accepted it only for myself. So the next user who comes through is still going to have to do that. Now, all this app is doing is going and reading the top 10 pieces of mail in my mailbox. Luckily, none of this looks super offensive. So these are the latest messages in my mailbox, which is awesome. So we managed to get a token. We consented to mail, even though mail was not one of our required permissions in our API permissions. And so this is a really, really neat part of the V2 endpoint, and that's what Christos is going to dig into, which is that as a developer, instead of me having to know what these are going to be up front and request them from the user up front, instead, I can ask for them as I need them. And that's going to take us down into what we call static and dynamic consent. So, Christos.
Yes, taking over with the quiz, right?
Oh, that's right. We do have a quiz. That's right.
We have a quiz time. Come on.
Let's do our quiz. Sorry.
Let's see if people have been paying attention, my friend. So
I always forget the quiz.
Or if we get to keep our jobs, right? So I'll let you try this one.
Okay. So which of the following statements is correct about consent? Only users can grant consent for an app to act on their behalf. No one can grant consent for another user. Only users can grant consent for an app to act on their behalf. No one can grant. My brain doesn't seem to want to read this question all the way through. But let's see. So B, users can grant permission consent to an app that requests it as long as the user has the permission. Okay. Or C, users can grant permission consent to an app that requests it, regardless of if the user has or doesn't have the permission. Well, I think we know it's not C. All right.
Absolutely.
No way you could consent for something that you don't have permission to.
Yeah.
So if we look at the other ones, only users can grant consent for an app to act on their behalf. So that part's true to a degree. No one can grant consent for another user. That seems a little extreme.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I would say it's B.
Yeah, I think it's B too.
Because it's where users can grant consent if they have the right permission, and if you're not admin, they cannot add consent, grant consent for everybody in the organization. Therefore, it's definitely not A. Let's go to the next one.
Cool. So the next one, which of the here we go with the double negatives again.
Double negative. Trying to confuse you.
Which of the following options is not a good practice to adopt when it comes to permissions? Only ask for the permissions required for implemented app functionality. When requesting permissions for app functionality, you should request the least privileged, not the least privileged, the least privileged access. When registering apps with Azure AD, it's a good idea to always use the admin consent option so users aren't bothered with the permission consent requests. And apps should gracefully handle scenarios where the user doesn't grant consent to the app when permissions are requested.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of words.
Yeah, remember it's which option isn't a good practice to adopt. We're not looking for the right answer. We're looking for the wrong right answer. If that makes any sense.
The worst practices.
Yeah, what would be the worst practice to do? And with
there we go.
Yeah. See, we simplify the question, we simplify the answer. So the worst one, I think, would be, what do I think? I say C, because can you imagine if everything had to go through admins? Your admins would be super upset.
I mean, your admins would be upset. Your users couldn't use the app. You couldn't even develop the app until somebody consented to it. That would be a huge pain. And, there may be apps where that's not even appropriate, right? Mm-hmm. Like, just because you let me read your calendar doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else should not even be asked up front, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's definitely a C for me.
It is a C for sure. Right.
Yeah.
Moving on to delegated permissions and consent. So JP can take a break now while I bombard you with words. So delegated permissions and consent. JP has already mentioned that. We have already described this. It's one of the one of the permissions that are supported from the Microsoft Identity Platform, and it is usually when a user has to delegate permissions to an app to act on their behalf. We don't want to confuse you with the on behalf flow as part of OAuth. So delegated permissions is when you as a user go to a web app or a mobile app and say, yeah, I want this application to go and read my calendar so I can get meaningful information. And they're used by apps that have a sign-in user. That's very important. You as a user can do that, or an admin can consent. And there's a question there from a guest that says, how does an administrator know when it's okay to consent on behalf of the organization? Most of the time, they don't even know the code behind the app. That is true. Does it all come down to trust? And where would you then say the responsibility lies when an administrator has consented? That's a very good question. Like if I create an app and go to our team, I haven't done it before, so I don't know if you, JP, have done it, but do they have to go through the code before the consent? Is that the process that is happening right now?
Well, on the one hand, I guess there are two things. On the one hand, if it's an app that is external, so a third-party app, say your company decided to buy Dropbox or something, right? Then a lot of that's going to be dependent on your relationship with the third-party SaaS vendor. We have what we call publisher verification, and that will put a little blue Twitter-style verified checkbox next to an app when a user's consenting to say, hey, this app is verified from Dropbox.com or wherever. And by doing that, you get a little bit more trust in the sense that the app has come from a vendor who has a Microsoft partner account, has domain validation that's occurred, has business record validation that's occurred based on the being a member of the partner network. But in the case of third-party SaaS, where you can't examine the code, of course, that's an exercise for the viewer of what's your relationship with, like, say, a company like a Dropbox, and how comfortable are you with what they're doing. when it comes to internally built applications, I know for us, we have to go through a pretty comprehensive security review if we need admin consent. Like we have to register in certain systems that they use for tracking. We have to have folks review the code, especially if they're high value or high privilege permissions that we need to have an admin consent to. Like we have to essentially justify and say, hey, this is why I need this permission. This is how I'm going to protect the credentials of the app or the certificates that are used for the app. Like it's a fairly manual human process to make that determination. And then on the, once it's been granted, then it's a matter of monitoring to see what actually is happening. So there are some apps that maybe don't use the permissions that they've been granted. They could be legacy apps that have asked for a bunch of permissions in the past and they don't actually need that many anymore. And some of the logging will help you find that out, but a lot of it is, especially with the high value ones, is why do you need it and having a pretty good business justification for it. And if permissions are too granular or too coarse and you don't necessarily want to grant that, but you want to grant it for a subset or something, then that's the kind of feedback that we need to hear and that we need to know about so we can make sure that our teams, it gets in front of the right teams, because it's a big part of what's going on out there in the ransomware worlds and everywhere else right now is, how do I get OAuth tokens? Because they're a lot more valuable than just pwning a machine, right? So.
Exactly. So admin due diligence, trust between the teams, a process to document what you're asking and why you're asking it, and continuous monitoring to make sure that the app has requests for permissions that they actually need and haven't requested for more. And there can be this kind of a back and forth between teams to make sure that they tweak things as they go. At any point when admins don't feel that things are going the right way, they can revoke those permissions, and you just have to either re-consent if there's a change of scope, or they have to go back and change the code if they need to. But that's the whole point of having this kind of consent framework, because me as a user have a visibility of what the app is doing with my data. So if something is asking to read all my calendars, but all this app is supposed to be doing is reading emails, suddenly they want access to my calendars or my contacts, then I don't know why, right? I don't want to consent that. I can actually report it. I don't know if on the next screen, in fact, you'll see here on the next, down at the very bottom, I think that's an older version, but when you're prompted for consent, you can actually also report an app if you get prompted for it. In fact, we'll see it when I do my demo. They can actually report it if it looks suspicious, or if something prompts you for consent when you haven't really done anything, suddenly you get prompted. That's weird behavior, so you can always report it. But as you can see here, that user consent safeguards you as a developer by saying, I only want these permissions, and as a user, where you only give access to specific permissions. If that trust is not there, then I'm not going to use your app, and then the developer is not going to be able to access my data. If it's an admin in place that can consent on your behalf, again, they can do it. But the very first time that you access an application that asks you to sign in, you need to give permission. Or if it's the first time that the app that you have already used is asking for new permissions with dynamic consent, as we'll see, then you again have to ask that. And this works in Azure AD these days to actually allow an application to elevate privilege halfway through by prompting the user to sign in. So for example, if I sign into my HR app internally, I might have access to some basic data, but if I need to go back into my salary information, then I may get prompted again to confirm that I am who I say I am, because I may sign into my HR web and then I go out for coffee, and then JP comes around, so like, hey, let's see how much money this guy makes, right? So he clicks into my salary link and then he gets prompted. Therefore, it protects me as well, which is nice. Banks usually do that as well. Are you sure you want to set up payment? Authenticate again to make sure that nobody has grabbed your phone and trying to set up an automated payment of sorts. Therefore, this consent is prevalent throughout the industry. Now, with the previous version of Azure AD, the V1 stuff, you had static consent, right? So you had to upfront go into the app registration and say, these are all the permissions my application is going to ask for. And you couldn't change it. You had to go back into the code if you want to change these and go back into your portal and ask that. And therefore, it wasn't really as flexible, right? So we decided to go with a V2 where we want to allow developers to be more dynamic. We also want applications to be more flexible. So for example, if I'm using an expenses app, as JP mentioned earlier, I might only want to give my expenses app access to some basic information. And if it asks me for, hey, do you want to add all your expenses into your calendars and create associations there? It might ask me for access to calendar information dynamically. It's another part of the app that I may or may not use. So if I don't like my expenses app to have access to my calendars, I might not give it access to that permission. I might not consent. And therefore, developers can still provide you with some basic functionality and at the same time be more dynamic. Now, there is a case where we might need to emulate behavior of a V1 endpoint. And this is where the .default scope comes into play. It also works in cases where we're still using V2, but we have, say, a console app. So that app does not have actually user interaction, and therefore they cannot consent to permissions. And because they cannot consent to those permissions and scopes, we have to use the .default. JP has put a fantastic blog post on the dev.to/425. So if you want to read about the .default, when and how that scope is a little bit tricky to get your head around. So that blog post is fantastic. I would highly recommend you jump into that and have a view. So dynamic consent is awesome because me as a developer can be more flexible with how I request consent. Users can also provide more granular access to the application. And ideally, you want to code around that experience. So if the user does not consent to a different permission that you request halfway through the app, then your application is not going to crash. But the fact that you don't have to request up front and bombard the user with like 20 different permissions that have to go through and it's not a good experience. So dynamic consent is where the money is. So I'm going to show you that with a demo. So we'll start with the previous web app that JP had, which requests, I think, emails. And then we will change that without actually changing the app registration, just to show you how easy it is to add different scopes. And without further ado, this is the application running over here. Let me see if it's already running. So that's my app. Make sure that this is still on the previous version. So if we look at the permissions, it has a different client ID because it is running in my tenant, right? So I'm not using JP's tenant, and that's my tenant ID over here, but it's the same URL. And in here, you'll notice I have mail.read, which is the previous scope, and then we'll change in a second. And then if we jump onto our Azure AD, in our app registration, if we go into the API permissions, you'll see that we have mail.read there, which was defined before. So now, if I were to run this application, so that would be node server.js, it's already running. So let's switch to the application itself. Let's refresh, make sure it's running, and then sign in. So I'm pretending this is the first time I'm signing into the application. So I'll be prompting for this consent. And as you can see here, it says read your email, which is the scope that we have configured and also request in the code. I will accept that. I forgot to show you the reported here. There you go. Lo and behold, all my messages are here. This is my test tenant, so I don't have any fear in showing you private information. Funny enough, if I were to run this demo with my Microsoft tenant app registration, it will actually block me. It will say it requires admin consent, which is good because it protects me from being silly and showing my corporate emails to you. But it's one of these things that protects me and the organization as well. Now let's go and change the code a little bit and see how that behavior would change. Remember, I'm not going to go back into my tenant, or my Azure AD. What's it's not portal. What did he say? What was the name again? Service portal, whatever it is. So we're changing the scope here from mail.read to calendars.read, right? There you go. So we're going to be in calendars, and we want to change the code a little bit since we're asking for calendars and not for messages anymore. We're using Graph because it's an API that's always out there and it's easy to use, but you can think of that as any API. So if you had your own API that has different endpoints that require different scopes, so let's say you have a calendar, not a calendar, you have a weather API, you have a weather read that is accessible to everyone, but you have a weather right that it's only accessible to certain admins or data controllers that can add the data, then you can have different scopes there. And this is how you would define different API endpoints. And in your application, your front end will be requesting those scopes, and accordingly, they will be granted to the users. So now, make sure we save this one and make sure we start the application. So it's listening out for 3007. I'm going to sign out and sign back in again. I'm not going to go all the way out, so just delete the local cookies here and 3007. And I'm going to sign in. Check this out. Now, go here. Because I've changed the consent, I'm being prompted again. If I were to just sign out and sign back in again without changing anything in the code, I wouldn't see this one. Now, pay attention to the reported here. Remember how I said that the screenshot we had was not actually super up to date? I wouldn't change that, but the reported here means I can actually send a message to my IT admin and say,
click
something
it.
wrong.
Click it. I want to see. I've never actually clicked that. Ooh.
I don't trust this application. I believe
this app will misuse my data. I like that.
I like it. No, I'm only going to get access to your calendar. I will never. Are you saying you don't trust me, JP? Right. So if I say accept, then lo and behold, I only have 3 meetings for today, and therefore this is what is displaying over there. Easy peasy like that. Now, if I were to go back into my Azure AD tenant as an admin, I might say, well, I didn't like the fact that this person was able to do all these things. I can go back to my service principal, and then, oh my God, what? I need to refresh this one, maybe. I think it had a reference to my old service principal, which I deleted, and therefore I had a wrong pointer. Live demos, just so you know. So deleting this one means that I will be reprompted again the next time I go into my application to sign in. And with that, I think we answered Zahir's question, which was the incremental consent still requires us to setting the permissions in the register application in the portal. No, you don't. The whole point of dynamic consent is that in the code, you can request these permissions at any point without adding anything into the Azure Active Directory registration.
Yeah, like if you took your app, right, that was showing the mail, and you said, maybe you had a automatically schedule me button or something similar, right?
Yeah.
Automatically schedule me, like that could have been, like that's totally optional, right? Like you could have, but you as a developer say, if you request that from the user, you don't have to go and add it to your app registration. In fact, if you look at Christos's app registration under API permissions, you still won't see calendars.read in there because he isn't, as the developer, formally asking for it up front to say, I need this for all authentication requests, but instead, because it's in the code, when that request is made, what actually happens is when that request is made, we try to make it behind the scenes. We try to make it with a CORS API request, and there are specific error codes that say, "Oh, nope, sorry, user needs to interact with this," and then the MSAL library handles all the drama to get a new window popped up and which permissions are going to be there and all that sort of stuff. All you do is tell MSAL what you need, and then everything just sort of flows down from there. So, yeah.
Which is a great point, as we got caught by that when we're doing Blazor WebAssembly, because it has a very different kind of a setup. And therefore, Blazor WebAssembly, for example, is one of these things that does not support dynamic consent within your application. You have to request your permissions upfront. You don't have to use that default, but you still need to request them upfront, and it will front load all the permissions you need in your application, which is one of these exceptions where even though we're using modern frameworks and modern languages, we still have to emulate the V1 behavior because of the fact of how MSAL and your .NET code interaction works. But this is probably one of the outliers there. Everything else is super well supported, and MSAL handles this kind of a dynamic prompting of the user with exception handling. Cool. So let's go back into our slides just to, so I'm still sharing. I'm just going to, was it presentation? Okay, I'm here. I found it. So we did static permissions to start with. Then we updated the SPA or SPA to request dynamic consents, and then we showed it by showing the calendar. So it's now time for our quiz. So I hope everyone has been paying attention. What is the difference between static and dynamic consent? Static consent is when the permissions are defined ahead of time in the app registration, while dynamic consent defines the permissions as they are needed by the app. Dynamic consent
sounds pretty good, right?
Sounds pretty good. And this is not a double negative, so pay attention. Dynamic consent is when the permissions can change over time within an app, while static consent permissions never change. And finally, static consent refers to the permissions all users have, while dynamic permissions only apply to some users. I think that last one is definitely out. So it's either between A and B. What do you say, JP? What do you think?
Well, they're both paragraphs.
Too many words.
So, yeah, have we hit word quota yet for these? Let's see. Static consent is when the permissions are defined ahead of time, while dynamic consent defines the permissions as they're needed. I mean, that feels like two very true statements. Aren't they the most true? Dynamic is when the permissions can change over time, while static will never change. I mean, never is pretty strong.
It is strong, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, you can always go add more in to the portal, right? So
true.
I'm feeling like that's probably going to be an A.
It is an A. You're absolutely right. It was an A. And the next one is, what role does a .default scope serve? The .default scope represents the basic permissions all apps need, or a request for the .default scope is equivalent to requesting all static permissions defined in the app registration. I think we defined that fairly well, to be honest. So with that, I would say it's definitely B for me.
This is an interesting question because A, it only has two responses.
A or B, yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting is that it's not a double negative. That's the second question. I was so used to them now. I'm thinking about this in terms of what isn't it is.
Trying to catch you, JP, if you're paying attention. And now back to you. Application permissions and consent. And when and how do we use them?
App permissions and consent. So these are the ones where we've got an application that's asking for it, and there's no user there to do consent. So the user isn't able to consent because there's no user present. There are two main scenarios where you're going to see this. The first one is in what's called the client credentials flow, and that's what we're gonna show a little bit of code here in a minute that dives into that. Client credentials flow, or the client credentials grant, and OAuth 2 is essentially a username and password that represents an application or a service principal. It's some kind of a client ID, like an application ID, combined with some kind of a client secret. Now, the client secret could be a string, or it could be a certificate, but it's essentially a set of credentials that represent an application without any sort of user context. Cool for Windows services, for integration jobs, for Azure Batch, or for some PowerShell script that needs to go and do a bunch of work on a bunch of users, or like importing users, for example. That's a big one that we see those used a lot for.
Azure Functions.
Azure Functions, right?
Yep.
Most managed identities that you get in Azure, for example, are, of course, they are service principals, and most of them do client credential style grants because your VM isn't going to be your VM is going to, it's going to talk as itself. It's not going to talk as a user who's interacting with application code. So the thing is, because app permissions are tend to be high privilege, not necessarily because they're highly privileged, but because they lack the granularity to be lower privileged. They have such breadth across a certain type of data. An admin has to consent to them always.
Yes.
So this means consenting to existing resources like Graph or Azure something, or like Azure Storage or something. In addition to those, your APIs that you build, where you've exposed scopes on your own, or exposed app roles for applications, all of those have to be admin consented. So something to think about. If you're building a lot of like service to service type of things, you'll need an admin to do that consent in order for, say, app 1 to get a token to talk to service 2. Those always require admin permissions, and that's usually because there's no user sitting in front of it. And so there's no way for us to say only, Carl is able to do this because Carl's here to do it. Instead, we got to do it for the whole group or for the whole organization because we have no idea. Oh, this is a familiar screen. So this screen, this is all about granting restrictions. And so this screen specifically, this is what you'll see if you are not an administrator and the permission that you need requires admin consent, or if you're trying to consent to or grant admin consent to an app role or to a service principal. This is the kind of screen that you're going to see if you're not able to do that, right? Your app needs to recognize that a user may click return to the app without granting consent, and perhaps certain permissions are already there, but the new ones that you asked for are not. And so you're going to have to be cognizant of what you've asked for and what your app capabilities are going to be with or without those different permissions, and then make a decision about what to do. Earlier, when we went through consent, we saw that there's this checkbox here. So if you are an administrator, Azure AD is going to figure that out, know that you're an admin, and give you the option to do it along with your regular consent, or to ignore it if you like. If you're building software, however, you may not necessarily want the first user through, like say you're a SaaS vendor building our expenses app as we talked about, you may not want the first user through to be the one that goes and does that work. And so instead, we have what's called a dedicated admin consent endpoint. And this admin consent endpoint is essentially a URL that you as the SaaS developer would send an administrator over to. So maybe they click a button, an administrator clicks a button, or as part of your onboarding process or part of your sign-up process, maybe they click a button that says, hey, you need to grant consent for this. I want to access your GAL or all your company's email or whatever. You can send this over, so you can send a user to this URL to say, hey, you're an administrator, so please go and consent. And then at that point, that application's been consented for administrators, and now your users aren't going to see it, or you're going to get the extra privileges that you're asking for. You can also do this straight in the portal. So if you're building apps on your own, directly in the portal, when you're configuring permissions, you'll see a grant admin consent for Contoso button, or for whatever button, right above your list of permissions. If you're an admin, you can click it. If you're not an admin, you can't click it. So pretty good, a pretty fast way to figure out if you're an admin or not. So the net of this, though, and you'll hear a lot of people saying this, is even though we have these app permissions, if you can do it with a user present, you should, because the user permissions are almost always going to be lower in terms of scope, or lower in size and scope compared to what you're going to get with app permissions. But in this case too, even like we talked about with the SaaS, we'll let the user sign in and then prompt them to do an admin consent as sort of a separate, deliberate activity. It makes it easier for you to tell your users why you're asking for that consent, what kind of things they should, what kind of functionality they're going to lose if they don't do it. It gives you the opportunity as the developer to, talk to your users a little bit more beforehand, to say, okay, by clicking this button, you're going to be granting whatever kind of extra permissions you may be asking for. Okay, so we're going to go take a look at some code for doing app permissions. Now, let me go ahead and get my browser up here. Do we have any questions while we're waiting, Christos?
Yeah, that's a good point. Jose Silva is asking, can we use it with LDAP too? I think the app registration, app consent framework, and what have you. I'm afraid not.
One of those things where it's like, well, you could, but you probably wouldn't want to. Like, LDAP is such a bazillion-year-old technology at this point. It doesn't work very well over the web. It's very susceptible to things like DNS that, generally speaking, no. Although there may be some ways that you could
hack it.
Finagle, is that maybe the right technical term to make it work
Yeah.
with like domain services? But generally speaking, no, this is not. Generally speaking, LDAP, your LDAP authentication pathways are totally different than this. This is all purely OpenID and OAuth 2.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you probably wouldn't want to. We wouldn't really be able to support anything like this in LDAP. There are some other kind of access management, entitlement management type services out there that would potentially help here, but generally speaking, I haven't seen a whole lot. There's definitely nothing Azure AD side for doing it with LDAP.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
No, that's it. All
okay,
yours.
Cool. So I think we've still got our headless app from the last time we did this, which is great. So we've got a console app in .NET. Let me go and get this app registration up, and then we'll go take a look at the code. Oh, my certificate or secret has expired, so that's good to know. So let's go take a look at this code. Now, this is just a pretty basic C# console app. Nothing too wild here. All it does is really what the other one did, which is it goes and talks to graphs to go get a list of mail messages or whatever, right? It has a few settings that it needs for MSAL to work, but all it really does at the end of the day is make a graph call to go and read mail. And there's some settings that we need in app settings.json in order to make this work. So we're going to go get those settings while we're sitting here. So let's start with our tenant ID. And tenant ID, that is our the same as our directory ID. So we'll go ahead and get that since it's sitting right here. So let's replace our tenant ID. Next, we need our apps ID, which of course we've been through that one 1,000 times, what our app ID is, so we know what that one's going to be. Now we need an application secret, and so I would get to go and create a new secret. So this is under certificates and secrets. This is essentially the credential for my application. So under certificates and secrets, we see a one called Delete Me that expired a couple weeks ago, which is good that it expired because obviously I've not been back to delete this one. So I will name this one Delete Me No Seriously this time.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll still have, let's have it expire. Let's see, it'll start today.
Tomorrow. Make it expire. I think you have to make it tomorrow, right? You can make it today?
I think I can even make it today, although I don't know if it's
that's gonna work.
I don't know if the toggle is midnight or 11:59, you know. So we'll have it expire tomorrow. So we'll go ahead and add the secret. And you'll notice our secret, here's our value. So we're going to copy this out. And for those of you watching, at this point, it's probably fairly clear that this is really not dramatically dissimilar from a username and a password. Mm-hmm. So we have a secret, we have an app ID. We don't call them username and password, but essentially they are. Now, the last thing we need is a target user, and that's only for this specific bit of code. To do a client credentials grant in OAuth 2, these are really the only bits that you need. Tenant ID, app ID, and application secret. You really don't need anything else to that. The target user ID is just because we're going to be making a graph call to look at a specific user. So let's go to get a specific user's ID, and I will get my ID because it's right here. And we're going to put that in over here on target user ID. So we've got our target user ID here. Now let's go look at the permissions on this app registration while we've got it up. I guess we don't have it up anymore, but that's okay. We can pull it up again. So we'll call this Learn Live Headless, I believe is what it's called. There it is. And if we look at the API permissions that are in here, let's collapse this down a little bit. If we look at the ones that we have files.readwrite.all, pretty privileged, mail.read, user.read, and we even have one for the Power BI service, which I don't entirely know why it's there. It's probably I was testing something and picked the wrong app. So we've got these permissions that are all here. Now you'll notice it says admin consent required. Yes, yes, no, yes. So 3 of these are admin consent required, and then the status as to whether or not they've been granted, right? So if we wanted to come in here and add a new one, say, for example, the calendars permission that we looked at earlier, we have delegated permissions. These are the ones that we use when we want to request them from a user. We also have application permission. And when we look here at application permissions, we start to search for something like calendar. We see calendars, and under calendars, we have calendars.read, calendars read write. And this is read calendars in all mailboxes. That's the key here. And of course, since it's an app permission, admin consent required will always be yes. Because of that, it'll always be yes. So let's add these permissions, even though I don't think we're actually going to use them just yet. And you'll notice it says that read calendars is admin consent required. However, it has not yet been granted. So if we try to request this permission, or sorry, if we try to request a token with this permission, it will actually fail, or we will get a token back with the other permissions we had requested and not this one. And so we fix that by granting admin consent. So do we want to grant admin consent? Yes, we do. So we're going to get that granted. Cool. So now our application is here, and this is essentially static consent, meaning we have to define what we need here, because if we don't, there's no opportunity for the app to go back and say, oh, wait a minute, I need to pop up a browser and ask the user to do this, because there's no user sitting in front of it. So let's go take a look at this code very briefly.
So there's something interesting here, because we haven't really talked about it before, but if you go back to your Azure AD registration, just to show something, because you have two different permissions, actually have two different resources, right? You have a Microsoft Graph and a Power BI service. So these are two different resources. Therefore, in your application, you can only get a token for one resource at a time. So even though you have .default to use, it's very important. If you grab a token, it will either be for the graph or for the Power BI. You can get a token that is for both. And I don't know if you were going to cover this one, but I suspect no, because we're not using Power BI in the console. But
well, no, it's a really good point, though, because we get asked the question all the time, which is, well, I need to access multiple APIs. And the key is you cannot get a token that is valid for two different APIs in a single token. You have to request them independently of each other and end up with two tokens. Now, you can have one token that represents all of these permissions that are part of the graph, but the tokens are resource specific. So the access token that I get is valid for the Microsoft Graph with any permissions that I have been conferred in Graph to go get them, right?
Yep.
Same with Power BI. If I need to go get a Power BI service, if I had more permissions here, all of those permissions would come in a single token, but it would be a single token intended only for Power BI. Yep. I couldn't use the Graph token in Power BI or on my own API and vice versa. And of course, the reason for that is these tokens are service specific. So I'm going to send my token for Graph always to the Graph, regardless of which permissions are in it, because it's a Graph token. And I'm going to call a different API endpoint for Power BI. When you're doing your API design, that's a big thing to keep in mind, which is in the case of Graph, Graph is a proxy to many different
resources
APIs.
or APIs,
right?
Yeah.
Resources, absolutely. So you kind of, as a developer, that's your opportunity to define what that API surface looks like and define the permission surface. But now at that point, your users' tokens are not going back. I'm not going to the Exchange API to go get my calendar and to the SharePoint API to get files. I'm going to the Graph, and Graph is figuring out what I do or don't have permission to do, and then making those changes appropriately. Thank you. Good call out. So we have our authenticated Graph client here that's gonna get called. And that's using the authentication provider, but all it's really doing is creating an MSAL object. So we talked about MSAL earlier. It's the Microsoft Authentication library that exists for lots of different languages. This is the one for .NET, and you'll notice we have this list of scopes here, and we have one scope. We have one scope, which is graph.microsoft.com/.default. And so because we're in a client credentials grant, we have to use the .default scope here. And this just tells Azure AD, hey, give me everything that has been statically consented. So it's just like a shortcut to old V1 behavior, but if you never used V1, that's where .default comes in. And it's purely because we don't have the ability to prompt a user and ask for anything. So, and then of course, when we do this get instance, you notice that we're sending our scopes. We're just sending our scopes into an array. So we're just taking our list and turning it into an array. Allocations for the win. Okay. We got all of our bits here. So let's go open our terminal and cover my secret, even though everybody's gotten it. I didn't realize that I forgot that app had so many permissions. I'm going to lower my zoom just a little bit, seeing as it's pretty hard to read. And so let's get into this folder and let's do a .NET run. And I hope everything is configured correctly, such that we see some email in my console window here. Now, I'm also on an exceedingly slow internet connection, so you may lose me as it's downloading the payload. It'll be
too
like,
many pixels.
It's like an old, like when you used to download, like when you go look at pictures on the internet, like on our Mondays, and you
One
get
line
like
at a time.
bar, one line at a
Oh,
time.
look at that.
Yeah, so there we go. Yeah, so we got some mail,
nice.
Which is great. We got some mail, and that's because we consented. And of course, if we'd gone and changed that, if we were to change this to events, because we also consented to calendar, we changed our call to events, we would also get our event data, which is super cool.
What's interesting here is that if you change the user ID to somebody else in your tenant, you will get all their data as well again.
Correct, because it is
application
not
permission.
User specific. Yeah, it's an app permission. Yeah, so it's they're super powerful. And like if I was doing a mail migration, this would be awesome because I could go read everybody's mail, migrate them from one tenant to another or whatever. But also very privileged. There's a lot of a lot of care and feeding that you have to do to make sure that those credentials, especially those super privileged ones, don't fall into the wrong hand. In fact, I'm going to get deleted now.
Yes, and talking about credentials, ideally, when you are developing an application for production or for your enterprise, you should be using client certificates, which are a lot more secure and better managed. Or you can use Key Vault to store that information and use something like a managed identity that can pull it at runtime to get the secret if you can't get around the fact that you have to use a certificate. I think JP is suffering with pixels there, but it's fine. We're going to go ahead and do our last quiz for the day. So let's see if you've been paying attention. And let's see, what do we have here? Application permissions differ from delegated permissions in all except which of the following ways? Damn, we're actually making tricky questions here. It's like university, right? Let's see. Let's see how well we'll do in college. Application permissions are for when there's no user interaction, while delegated permissions involve interaction with assigned user. Okay. Application permissions are granted by a user to the application to act on their behalf, while delegated permissions are granted by an application to a user. And finally, application permissions are higher privilege permissions than delegated permissions.
Okay, so hang on. I got to parse this question all the way down. I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow. I got to get my phone working. Oh no. So hang on.
Maybe they were not fast enough.
App permissions differ from delegated in all except. So we're trying to say. So the question is, app permissions are different from delegated permissions.
Apart from.
Okay. So app permissions are for when there's no user interaction, and delegated are involve the interaction. I mean, I guess that's true. Okay. App permissions are granted by a user to the application
to act on their behalf.
While delegated permissions are granted by an app to a user. That whole statement just feels false to me. I don't know what it is. The whole thing just feels wrong.
Well, I think it's a double negative that makes it super tricky, but it is B. In favor of time to make sure that we can cover all of them. Let's go to the next one. To grant application permissions, which of the following statements isn't a valid option? Double negative, my friends. Pay attention. Send the user to the application consent endpoint with the proper parameters on the query string. Send the user to the admin consent endpoint with the proper parameters on the query string. And finally, select the Grant Admin Consent button within the Azure AD Admin Center that will display an admin consent. Now, this is a negative. Which of these following statements isn't a valid option? So take your time, think about it. Double negatives.
So the big thing, of course, is that if we think about who is allowed to consent to an app permission, I think that is the key to this question anyway.
Admins and users. Or admins are users, aren't they? So it's users.
Oh, see, now we're getting very existential. What is an admin if not a user? Is an admin like a superclass of a user?
Are admin people?
Is an admin a derived class of a user, or is it the other way around? Are users derived from admins? I don't know.
No, it's
No, I
it's
guess
an
they wouldn't be.
admin is derived by a user, and it just has some additional properties. So the
Is it
base
like in
class
Minecraft where you take, because my 7-year-old, of course, he's been killing me about Minecraft. So you start with a user, and then how do you turn them into an admin? What would you craft on the crafting table to make them an admin?
A cape.
To go from user to an admin. A cape?
Cape. And a big button that says consent. Right. So the right answer is, well, wrong answer, because remember, it's a negative. It's to send a user to the application consent endpoint with the proper parameters on the query string.
Correct. It's false. Like
correct.
You wouldn't say, because the user can't do app permissions. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's the right answer, or the wrong answer. Okay. So in summary, we learned about the consent framework, which is very important for developers and for users to create that kind of a trust. It allows us to obtain permissions for OAuth 2, and with the tokens acquired, we can pass them down to different resources. And then we looked at web hosted and console apps and how they differ, the dynamic and static consents, and the admin consent where it's needed. The .default, as well, as I said, is one of these things that can catch you on. So make sure to read JP's awesome blog. Now, remember, this was part 3 of our 5-part series. We have a special episode this Wednesday on the 15th. It's the 15th or the 14th? 14th.
I think it's the 14th.
The 14th. I'm mixing my days. It's the middle of the summer, so I'm all messed up. But this Wednesday, we'll have episode 4. It's a special episode, trying to catch up. Where we're going to be covering secure custom APIs with the Microsoft Identity. You learn how to create your own APIs and secure them and call them from the front end, which is pretty awesome. And then we have one more episode next Tuesday to talk about working with user groups and roles.
Next Monday.
What'd they say?
You said next Tuesday. Next Monday.
Next Monday. So Tuesdays we have our 45. So yes.
I don't even know what day of the week it is right now.
We don't know what day of the week is. Who needs to know anyway, right?
It's summertime.
It's summertime, exactly. So yeah, again, if you want to go and do it yourself and have our video on the side to keep you company, then make sure to follow this URL, ak.ms/learn-identity-permissions-consent. And we had a few questions that came throughout there. So thanks everyone for participating and helping us out. JP, any last words for the day?
Famous last words.
Famous last words.
Yeah, so we are going to come back on Wednesday to do the 4th one. So all about API security. That'll be cool. And if you have any questions here, there are lots and lots of different Learn modules. This is not the only Learn module that we have. So there are lots of different modules, and the modules make up paths, and so you can go find those on ak.ms/learn, I believe. For anything and everything. I mean, we saw one out there the other day for like learning Rust or, any sort of Microsoft thing that you're going through, Azure, Office, administrative stuff, dev stuff. Chances are you'll find certification. Yeah.
Well. Yep.
Chances are you'll find a Learn path out there, and to whatever kind of new skills you're looking to learn. So, and of course we'll be back. Yeah, to learn more. We'll be back. We'll be back Wednesday. Yeah, learn more on Learn TV. Learn more on Learn Live on Learn TV.
There you go. We got it. So many learns. It's all about learning, my friends.
One day we'll figure it out.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our awesome moderators, Rob and Glenn, that did a fantastic job, and Kim for keeping us straight. And we appreciate everyone for joining us today. Have a fantastic afternoon. We'll see you all on Wednesday, and go learn something.
Yeah. See you, everybody.